The first Prince of Persia game in 14 years, if we don't count reboots, ports, and remakes, was Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. The beloved Ubisoft franchise that inspired Assassin's Creed and gave us an all-time gaming classic with The Sands of Time had been through quite the release drought until January 2024. And now, 365 days later, it's time for us to see what sort of expectations fans, critics, and Ubisoft had towards this game, and whether or not it lived up to them. But first things first, we need to take a look at what the expectations were. There are a few different interested parties here, so let's start with the fans and critics. After such a long period without an addition to the mainline series, and with multiple announcements of delays to the Sands of Time remake, it's safe to say that fans of the franchise were hungry for something. Anything, really. So when Ubisoft announced a new title in the series, fans were understandably excited and then immediately disappointed. That is, if we take the initial trailer's engagement rates into consideration. The response was generally negative. Fans had issues with the protagonist. You would no longer play as the prince, but rather as Sargon, a member of the Immortals on a quest to save the prince. The graphics were another point of tension, being compared to something more akin to Fortnite, with some people going so far as to calling it a mobile game in style. And just generally, the vibe of the trailer seemed off. It just didn't feel like Prince of Persia to many. Not the strongest start here, but what were fans expecting exactly from a new game developed by Ubisoft? I'd argue they expected a high-quality game capable of reviving a dormant franchise. Question is, was that achieved? The game boasts an 87 top critic average on OpenCritic with a 96% critics recommend score. This is well above average in terms of ratings, and truly, The Lost Crown was one of the best games to come out of 2024. It was even nominated for Best Action Adventure Game, which it ended up losing to the eventual Game of the Year winner Astrobot, and it was also nominated and won for Innovation in Accessibility. And the game really was a breath of fresh air from Ubisoft, where they left many of their Ubiisms aside. The Metroidvania style allowed for a large, interconnected world, but that didn't feel too big and empty like many of Ubisoft's usual open-world games. A lot of the design feels intentional and engaging, which makes navigating around the different regions an enjoyable experience. The hack-and-slash mechanics were clean and smooth. The platforming offers a nice balance of difficulty, much like the puzzles that range from easy, get-it-on-the-first-try experiences, all the way up to hard, you're gonna need to think about this one a little bit. The addition of memory shards also made backtracking so much better, as you can place down markers on the map leading to inaccessible areas and easily find where you need to go back to once you unlock new abilities. Some areas are a little tedious to navigate through, though the overall movement system is quite fluid and responsive. Most fans and critics seem to have stuck on the story as the weakest point of the game. It's nothing to write home about, but it's definitely not bad enough to take you out of the immersion of the universe. It's just a little forgettable. So all in all, we're looking at a game that managed to deliver in the quality department and also launched with relatively minimal bugs, which seems like a huge feat when compared to most other AAA games these days, especially those from Ubisoft. One could probably argue this is more of a AA game, despite being made by a AAA studio, because of the resources that were attributed to it. But I digress. Is it the revival of the franchise that players wanted? Well, that'll depend on future plans for sequels from Ubisoft, which we'll talk about in a bit, but for now, I'm going to consider fan expectations as being met. Alright, let's move on to the developer side. I'm going to split Ubisoft's expectations in two, with one side being the actual development team and the other being the executive side. Dev team first. In an interview with Game Rant, narrative and animation director Jacques Execs said the following: "Since the first episodes, the Prince of Persia brand has been built on pillars that quickly became its signature. We absolutely wanted to be part of this legacy and respect these pillars that the players have loved. A balance between combat, acrobatics, and puzzles, supported by a strong story in Persian fantasy. The theme of time is also one of the historical strengths of the brand. We wanted to both respect this unique DNA and offer a new approach to it." Seems like a clear-cut list of what the team was trying to achieve. Mix of combat, acrobatics, and puzzles? Check. Strong story rooted in Persian fantasy? Debatable on the strong part, but the game 100% takes great inspiration from Persian mythology to offer an interesting universe, so let's also call that a check. The theme of time? Well, there are a bunch of powers that Sargon can wield that involve time and space, and while the original powers from the Sands of Time aren't utilized by Sargon, they do still make an appearance elsewhere in the game. And the whole world makes clever use of time and lack thereof. So for this one, let's also say check. All in all, the dev team was indeed able to accomplish its goal of creating a game that both respects the original DNA of its predecessors while also bringing something new to the franchise. Hell, the original creator of Prince of Persia, Jordan Mechnar, was very vocally supportive of the game, calling it the Prince of Persia game I've been wishing for. Plus, the 2.5D side-scroller was a nice touch to pay homage to the very first Prince of Persia games, while also allowing for all of the fantastic gameplay options that we went over in the previous section. So, were expectations for Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown met by the development team? Again, we're going to say yes. All that leaves is for us to examine the Ubisoft executive team's expectations, and we can give a definitive answer. We'll do our best to figure out what the forecasted sales were versus the actual ones, but precise numbers will be near impossible to find, so some of this will be speculative. Luckily for us, though, Insider Gaming published an article in October 2024 that is quite revealing. They wrote that Ubisoft was expecting The Lost Crown to sell similarly to the biggest Metroidvanias in the market, with millions of units sold in a relatively short space of time. In that very same report, we also learned that Ubisoft had moved on from the game and any potential sequel as early as May of 2024, which is just 4 months after the launch, citing missed internal expectations as the main reason. Well, we have our answer right there, but for those curious, let's take a closer look. As per the same source, we can see that Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown attracted 300,000 players in 2 weeks, with an estimated $50 million in revenue. And 9 months later, at the time that Insider Gaming had written the report, the game had surpassed 1 million units sold. So, were expectations for Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown met by Ubisoft as a whole? No, they were not. Curious though, because The Lost Crown is a fantastic game that launched to critical success and had decent sales figures, yet for some reason Ubisoft considers it a failure. Now, if you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to dig deeper into the launch plan and sale expectations for the game so as to try and understand what it is that Ubisoft was after exactly and how they shot themselves in the foot with their strategy. Alright, first off, the release window. January 18th certainly isn't a date doing anyone any favors. It's right after the big holiday push, a time where consumer spending has cooled off significantly. One might argue that it's the perfect time to release a game as the competition is minimal, but on the contrary, people just aren't as willing to open up their wallets during this time. Ubisoft was probably trying to avoid conflicting release windows with their other games like the quadruple A pirate experience that was Skull and Bones in February, X-Defiant in May, and Star Wars Outlaws in August. In any case, the release window wasn't the only contributing factor, but it certainly didn't help. Second, game accessibility. And what I mean by this is where can I buy the game and how much does it cost me? Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown hit all major consoles as of launch, as well as PC through Epic Games Store and Ubisoft Connect. It wouldn't be until August that the game would finally come to Steam. It also wasn't present on any major gaming subscription services other than Ubisoft Plus, but I really wouldn't include that in the same league as Game Pass or PS Plus in terms of what it can do to move the needle on player count. The game also cost $49.99 at launch. For a AAA game, that's pretty good. However, everything seems to suggest that the title was meant as more of a AA experience, which makes the price just alright. Ubisoft's determination to avoid Steam has always been a case for hurting their own sales on PC, and the price, well, not the steepest on the market, was still marginally higher than most other Metroidvania experiences, which I'll talk about here in a bit. Also, Ubisoft has earned itself a reputation for putting their games on sale quite quickly following their release, so truly, why pay full price when you know you can get it on sale just a couple months later? And finally, the marketing. Ubisoft first revealed The Last Crown about half a year prior to its release during the E3 and Summer Game Fest timeframe of June. Not much else was shown about the title until a new gameplay trailer dropped a month before release in December 2023. And that's about it. Ubisoft kept pretty quiet about the game, preferring to invest their dollars on Star Wars Outlaws, Assassin's Creed Shadows, and Skull and Bones. Combine all these factors together and you get a game from a major developer and publisher that wasn't readily accessible to all players, that came with a weird release window and an okay but not super enticing launch price. And it wasn't marketed all that well despite being a storied franchise getting its first game in over a decade. It should therefore come as a surprise to no one, except Ubisoft apparently, that it didn't perform all that well, as it was never given a fighting chance. 300,000 players is far from the millions of units that they expected to sell in a short period of time, but what exactly were they comparing themselves to? I mean, in terms of Metroidvania games, we're far from being the best seller for sure, but it's still decent numbers. We'll never know for sure who exactly Ubisoft was trying to compare themselves to, but we can still take a look at a few well-known and somewhat recent Metroidvania titles to try and demystify all this. First off, Metroid Dread is an action-adventure side-scroller that came out in 2021 exclusively on the Nintendo Switch at the price of $59.99. It sold about 854,000 copies in its first month in the United States, and if we factor in the rest of the world, we're talking somewhere around 1 million copies sold in just that first month. The game then managed to reach 3 million copies sold sometime in December 2022, which was approximately a year and 2 months following its release. Now, the price of Metroid Dread was $10 higher than that of The Lost Crown, and yet it still sold better, but I mean, come on, it's Metroid, and it's Nintendo. No surprises here, and Nintendo has certainly earned themselves a better reputation than Ubisoft, so their higher-priced games still manage to sell exceedingly well. And Metroid is a legendary franchise that has been far more consistent with its releases than Prince of Persia. If Ubisoft was trying to shoot for the moon by wanting the numbers that Metroid Dread put up, then they were absolutely kidding themselves. Hollow Knight is a Metroidvania game that came out in 2017, the first game to be developed by Team Cherry and launched with a $15 price tag. It sold 500,000 copies in its first 9 months, only reaching the 1 million mark nearly a year and a half after its release. Important to note though that at this time it was only available on PC. An eventual Switch port came on June 12, 2018, and a PS4 and Xbox One port came on September 25th of the same year. With that in mind, the game hit a 2.8 million units sold milestone in February 2019, meaning 2 years after its release. The Lost Crown had doubled its sales by the 9-month mark, though admittedly, comparing Prince of Persia to an, at the time, unknown franchise like Hollow Knight isn't exactly fair. But Hollow Knight is still one of the best-selling Metroidvanias in the past few years thanks to its now cult following, hence why I'm including it here. So, if Ubisoft was comparing themselves to Hollow Knight, they've been doing better in terms of sales if we choose similar timeframes to look at. And that's with a vastly different price tag, Prince of Persia being $49.99 at launch, which is $35 more than Hollow Knight. Final example, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is a 2D Metroidvania and is the sequel to 2015's critically acclaimed Ori and the Blind Forest. It's an Xbox exclusive that came out in March 2020, and it did make its way to the Switch later in that year. Its initial launch price was $29.99, and it managed to hit 2 million players 3 months after its release. Important thing to note here is that I'm using players rather than units sold because the game was available on Game Pass day 1, so it's a little harder to pinpoint the exact sales figures, but it still gives us a good example of what player count can do when factoring in easy access to the game. Prince of Persia pales in comparison in terms of player count, but again, its price isn't as enticing as Will of the Wisps and also wasn't available on any major gaming subscription services. So, Ubisoft didn't meet its own expectations with Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, but it also set itself up for failure with its out-of-proportion sales targets in the first place. And they never even gave themselves a chance to try and achieve them by not properly examining the reasons that made those other Metroidvania games so successful. Again, I'm speculating on if those titles are even the ones they were comparing themselves to, but it stands to reason that they could have learned valuable lessons from looking more closely at those very games. So in the end, Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown stands as a fantastic Metroidvania that could have served to pave the way for a new era of Prince of Persia games. Instead, the team was disbanded and made to work on several other projects that may very well just suffer the same fate. Critics, fans, and the development team were clearly satisfied with The Lost Crown, as they should be, but Ubisoft's lofty goals and inability to achieve them, or just set realistic ones in the first place, will have ultimately prevented The Lost Crown from fully meeting expectations. I'll keep my eyes on the rogue Prince of Persia, still pending its full release, but until then, the future of the franchise remains in limbo. In the meantime though, The Lost Crown is a fantastic game that I highly recommend to any fans of the Metroidvania genre.